It's Tuesday, the 6th of September, the day the UK gets a new Prime Minister. And this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Chris Skidmore, Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson, Politico's UK editor Jack Blanchard and Emily Carver of the free market think tank the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today,
I am now like one of those booster rockets that has fulfilled its function, and I will now be gently re-entering the atmosphere and splashing down invisibly in some remote and obscure corner of the Pacific.
Boris Johnson, accompanied by his wife Carrie, leaves Downing Street for the last time and travels to Balmoral for an audience with the Queen to formally resign. Liz Truss is expected to arrive at Balmoral in a few minutes' time. You can see the live shot there just by the entrance to Balmoral. She'll be meeting the Queen and be invited formally to form a government, becoming the 15th Prime Minister of the Queen's reign. When she arrives at Downing Street later on today, a series of crises face her. The cost of living, the NHS, and a war in Europe. How will she tackle them? Welcome. Well, you heard Boris Johnson and saw him there on Downing Street, just outside the famous Black Door number 10, giving his farewell speech. Let's have a listen to a bit more of it.
Like Cincinnatus, I am returning to my plough, and I will be offering this government nothing but the most fervent support. But I say to my fellow Conservatives, it's time for politics to be over, folks. It's time for us all to get behind Liz Truss and her team and her programme and deliver for the people of this country. Because that is what the people of this country want, that's what they need, and that's what they deserve.
Boris Johnson there giving his wholehearted support to his successor, Liz Truss. Have we seen the last of him, Chris?
I mean, who knows with Boris? I think you can't really read the runes into any speech he gives. Obviously, he's potentially going to go off and go back to the ranks of being a journalist for all we know. He said he's not going to attend party conference. He's going to spend a bit of time outside politics at the front line. But, Boris is Boris and likes the limelight, so we'll see what happens, I guess.
So you would be surprised?
The priority, I think, for the Conservative Party and obviously all MPs is thinking about the general election, which seems now planned for 2024.
Yeah.
Boris obviously is still a member of Parliament. He's in a marginal seat just out on the outskirts of London. You have to decide whether he's going to stand or whether he's not going to stand in that seat, I guess. So at the moment, he's still a serving member of Parliament on the back benches. Bridget
Phillipson, do you think we've seen the last of Boris Johnson?
God, I hope so. I mean, that was just the same self-indulgent nonsense that I think the public have really grown tired of. No sense of any kind of real responsibility as to why he is no longer Prime Minister. But I think, obviously, we do now move on as a country. We're going to have a new Prime Minister in the shape of Liz Truss, someone who has been behind all of these key decisions these last 12 years. And she's the reason, of course, that, along with her colleagues, people can't get a GP appointment. And when you call the police, you can't guarantee they're able to come. And when childcare isn't there when parents need it. So, she's been responsible for a lot of the problems that we've got coming. And no plan, as we've seen so far, where it comes to energy bills and the cost of living, which is a massive pressure right now on families. And, we've been clear in the Labour Party that we would make sure that people get the support that they need through the winter, paid for by taxing the profits of oil and gas companies. It's not clear at all to me that that's the approach that Liz Truss is going to take.
Right. I think we're just going to break into these pictures, the live pictures. As we said, there is a cavalcade, a small one, arriving at the entrance of Balmoral. We presume that in one of those vehicles is Liz Truss, about to arrive. There you go, through the gates there of Balmoral to meet the Queen in a ceremony known as the Kissing of Hands, and she'll be asked formally to put together the next government. Meanwhile, let's stick a little bit longer with Boris Johnson departing, because, of course, he has now tendered his resignation to the Queen. There was, of course, course, a tantalising line that's been interpreted by historians, and Boris Johnson, Jack, is a sort of ancient classic scholar, if you like, about Cincinnatus, a Roman general who, yes, returned to his plough and then returned to power.
Yeah, never has one Wikipedia page been visited so frequently by all of Westminster at before 8 o'clock in the morning.
That is very true.
Joe, but I mean, he's enjoying this, isn't he? He's enjoying dropping these little hints that much as he might be being ushered out of the door by his party, he'd really quite like to come back again one day, and he thinks he's got every chance of doing so. And the truth is, for as long as the polling of Tory members show that he's the most popular person to lead the party, that possibility will always be there in the background, and he quite clearly likes stoking the fire and prodding the party, and I suspect he'll continue to do so.
Right, well, the handover of power is about to take place because there is Liz Truss's vehicle pulling up outside Balmoral. Of course, it's happening there because of mobility issues for the Queen, very unusually for both the departing Prime Minister and the new Prime Minister to fly up to see the Queen rather than it taking place in Buckingham Palace or perhaps Windsor Castle. There she is, being greeted outside the gates. Of course, Boris Johnson was there just half an hour or so ago, 45 minutes. I think the weather has somewhat hampered the arrival, but there she is with her husband, Hugh O'Leary, arriving to meet the Queen. Towards the end of the programme, we will bring you any more developments or pictures, indeed, of that handover of power. Boris Johnson, Bridget Phillipson says she hopes she's seen the last of him for the reasons that she outlined. Chris Skidmore can't be sure that we've seen the last of him. Do you think there is any sense, Emily Carver, of sort of seller's remorse by parts of the Conservative Party when it comes to Boris Johnson?
Well, he did have that ability to mobilise support in areas of the country that the Conservatives had failed to do so for so long. I think among the Conservative Party membership, there certainly was a little bit of seller's remorse, or they would have liked to have seen him on the ballot, because he does have that star profile that Liz Truss doesn't seem to have. In terms of whether he'll make a comeback, I think he might be tempted, because he always seems to be quite short of cash despite his reasonable income. So he may well do a lot of the speaker circuit, do a lot of columns, do a lot of media appearances, write books, and then come back once he's got a bit more cash in the bank. Right.
There is, of course, the Privileges Committee, Chris Skidmore, the committee that has an inquiry looking into whether or not Boris Johnson misled Parliament over what he said regarding parties that went on during his time as Prime Minister. There have been calls in parts of the Conservative Party for that to be sort of junked. Where are you? Well,
There is a broader ethical standards issue around if you're a minister or, say Bridget, if there's a general election, Labour come to power and you're standing at the dispatch box, and I've stood at the dispatch box as a minister before, and I say something incorrectly, then obviously you're meant to correct the record. I have sometimes said things incorrectly thinking it's the truth. It's inadvertently, I've actually misled the House. Well, I haven't misled the House, but sort of you make a correction in the record. And I think the point that some people are making around this inquiry, this sort of looking at what the Prime Minister's done, is whether he inadvertently led the House means that he could be sanctioned for inadvertently misleading the House. And that could set a dangerous precedent where ministers will not be as open with the House as they should be if they're in fear of inadvertently misleading the House and then finding they're going to be sanctioned for it.
He could have just corrected the record straight away.
He could have corrected the record.
And he chose not to.
Well, I agree with that. I think sort of that may have saved a lot of trouble in the long term. But we are where we are now. And the question is obviously whether this becomes a precedent that would be damaging for our democracy in the future.
Well, all right. Well, you've given
you've
given a detailed explanation, but there'll be a lot of people watching this programme that just feel that this inquiry should go ahead on the basis of what we know now in terms of what happened, and that this is an argument over semantics about inadvertently misleading the House, failing to correct the record. Do you think this inquiry should go ahead?
Well, at the time, all MPs agreed that the inquiry should take place. So on that basis, I'm very happy for it to continue. Obviously, there are some of my colleagues who are pushing for it not to continue, but we did pass a motion cross-party for it to happen.
Right, but what do you make of the legal advice that has emerged, that was commissioned, Bridget Phillipson, by Number 10, that seems to back up the argument that we've just heard there, outlined by Chris Skidmore, that actually this wouldn't be a fair process?
I'm concerned that taxpayers' money is being used to procure advice for essentially the actions of an individual MP. I'm not sure that's available to all members of Parliament. I'd be interested to know how that decision was reached. I don't think that's a good use of public money. I think, you know, we're in a cost of living crisis. If we can save money, we might save it by not spending money on a defence of the indefensible. The House, you know, Chris is right, the House passed a motion that this should be considered. I'm confident that the Privileges Committee will do their job thoroughly and fairly. The reason we've gotten to this position is because of a failure to adhere to the basic standards I think the public expect in our country. And if the new Prime Minister seeks to push back against that, I think that's very damaging and very dangerous.
It could be difficult for Liz Truss, this whole issue, couldn't it, Jack Blanchard? I mean, just seeing this headline in The Independent, Boris Johnson makes last-ditch attempt to clear his name on Partygate. This is also reporting that a replacement for Laura Farris, the Conservative MP who had decided to resign from the Privileges Committee, may be replaced by another Conservative MP called Christopher Chope, who is a stickler for parliamentary procedure, and that might in some way aid Boris Johnson.
Yeah, one of the most controversial figures on the Tory backbenches. I would probably say it would be quite an eyebrow-raising choice if that does indeed go through. I think you're right, it is a problem for Liz Truss, and she's got enough big problems on her plate to worry about without this, frankly. I haven't really got a view on whether he misled the House or not, but I do think it would be a pretty grim sign if one of the first things she did was try to change the rules of Parliament again, as Boris Johnson famously tried to do over the Owen Paterson affair, and was, you know, rightly castigated for the way the government acted then. This is supposed to be a clean start. That was supposed to be the whole point of having a leadership contest and bringing a new leader. If she continues in a similar vein, I don't think that's going to send a very good signal to her party or to anybody else.
Well, as you said, Liz Truss has a very full and difficult in-tray. Let's just have a look at some of the front pages in terms of the challenge ahead. We can have a look at the Daily Express, put faith in Truss to deliver for Britain. One of the other front pages, she's on pretty well all of them, but Daily Mail, cometh the hour, cometh the woman. And then the Mirror has something different. You can see Conservative leaders past and present. They're on the same old Tories is their headline. Do you agree, though, Bridget Phillipson, that one of the things that the Conservatives have been quite good at is delivering female Prime Ministers? She will be the third female Conservative Prime Minister. Why has Labour not managed it?
Well, I always like to see women in high office and in areas of public life, but I think, you know, the judgment that I will make and the public will make of Liz Truss is how successful she is, particularly in addressing the cost of living challenge that we face right now as a country. But we face that challenge because we've had 12 years of Conservative governments. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. We're now on to our fourth Conservative Prime Minister in that time. And what have we got to show for these last 12 years? We've got a winter crisis in the NHS in summertime. We've got people waiting for hours on end for ambulances. People cannot get GP appointments, 6-week waits, you know, antisocial behaviour plaguing so many of our communities, life getting really tough for a lot of families. They can't afford to feed their kids. I think that will be what will matter most, whether we have a government that does anything about that or really understands the pressures that families are facing right now.
I mean, it is a huge challenge for Liz Truss, Chris Gibmore. Does she need to reach out to other wings of the party? You backed Rishi Sunak at the beginning of the leadership contest. Like many of your colleagues, you switched to Liz Truss. People can make their own minds about what attracted you to the winning candidate, as it seemed during that contest, Liz Truss. But does she need to reach out to some of your colleagues from different wings of the party, including you?
Well, I was a swing voter, I guess, and that's how democracy works, isn't it? Every party wants people to come onto their side.
Yes, but is she going to reach out to people like you?
I think, you know, what we've seen already with Liz is this opportunity to say, let's be forward-facing, let's think about growth, let's be positive. And one of the reasons why I went over to her was actually she wasn't that negative, you know, in the campaign itself, and I think she put out a positive campaign during August. We're going to have to build bridges. The party's going to have to come back together. You know, we have to unite or die. We're only, as I said, 2 years away from a general election. That will, I think, bring a lot of discipline into Tory MPs', at least I hope it will bring a lot of discipline into Tory MPs' mind. Otherwise, we're going to lose the next general election.
Emily?
Well, the Telegraph had on its front page today that Penny Mordaunt could be an option for the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, that might be a way of Liz Truss reaching across the party. Because, of course, Penny Mordaunt was very successful with the Conservative Party membership. Obviously, she wasn't in the final two, but she was very popular and she represents a different strand of conservatism, perhaps a more centrist brand. But Liz Truss wants to brand herself, and is through and through, a free market, classical, liberal, conservative. So she'll want to stick to that, and that's her boosterist.
Well, we're going to discuss in a moment how ideological she will be, or whether she will be more pragmatic when it comes particularly to the issue of the energy package that we are expecting in the next few days. But in terms of the party itself, Jack, what do you think? It doesn't sound, actually, if all the reports are true, that she is reaching out to the other parts of the Conservative Party in terms of her cabinet, which she will announce tomorrow.
No, so far that doesn't appear to be the case. So, of course, none of those appointments have actually been made yet, so we may be surprised. No. But I think it's a risky strategy not to do it. It can work. If you're successful, you'd be amazed how Tory MPs or any MPs will come into line behind you if they think you're a winner and you're going to win an election. But if you're not, and when you hit the rocks, as Boris Johnson has found, if you haven't tried to bring lots of people in behind you, suddenly you've got a lot of enemies there waiting on the back benches, ready to turn on you if you hit problems. And given the circumstances she's facing in the country, she's likely to hit some problems over the next year or two.
Well, I think that is undoubtable. Let's just show you the Royal Communications here. Tuesday, the 6th of September, the Right Honourable Boris Johnson MP had an audience of the Queen this morning and tenders his resignation as Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury, the other post held by the Prime Minister, which Her Majesty was graciously pleased to accept. Now, let's just show you the front page of the Financial Times with the headline, Truss in £100 billion energy plan. This looks as if it is going to form part of the response from Liz Truss's government in terms of soaring energy bills. They are currently just under £2,000 a year for the average bill annually, but they're due to go up to over £3,500 in October. Let's talk to the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack, who's been following the story very closely. What is her plan, do you think, Simon?
Well, Joe, this is a moving target. There's a number of different plans across lots of different newspapers today, but here's what I think we know, which is that on Thursday she wants to announce a major intervention into the wholesale energy, gas and electricity markets with the aim of doing a couple of things. Keeping bills frozen at their current level, stopping them rising to £3,500 in October, and doing that throughout this winter and possibly into next winter as well. They're also going to announce support for businesses. If you bring the wholesale price down, it affects businesses too. The exact mechanism of how that would work is unclear because we don't have an energy price cap for businesses, so it might mandate the energy suppliers to reduce their unit cost of energy to the businesses they supply. Now, this is going to cost an eye-watering amount of money. The total package, I'm told, is somewhere between 100 billion and 130 billion. Now, clearly, someone's got to pay for the difference between where you set the new price and what the real price is in the real world. Now, two versions of this. The energy companies would take out loans to fund that difference, backed by the Treasury to lower their cost, and the repayments on those loans would either flow through bills on people's customer bills for the next 10 to even 20 years, or be paid through by general taxation. The energy companies don't care, they're agnostic as long as they get paid, but if you put it through energy bills for the next 20 years, people will call it an energy poll tax. That will be Labour's approach. If you put it through general taxation, people would say, hang on a second, Liz Truss, you said, read my lips, no new taxes. What I'm also told is that the reason it's difficult to quantify and put in a box is because there's going to be these supply side reforms. For example, they're going to set prices for old renewables, which are actually fluctuating along with the price of gas. There's no reason why the electricity generated by some of these older renewable wind farms and solar farms should be priced at the same price as we're getting for those generated by gas. Break that link, you bring down bills. You could do that by next year potentially, and that would mean the supply side would bring prices down as well. So a very shape-shifting, moving target, but those are some of the things we're expecting to hear on Thursday.
Is there flexibility in terms of the length of time? Because we don't know how long gas prices are going to remain high, or the price of wholesale gas is going to remain, because, of course, that is very much directed by the war and the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia's response in turning off pipelines, etc. This plan is for around 18 months, you say, but could it be extended?
Well, I mean, it could be, but then you know, it's in a way you're writing a blank check, aren't you? As long as you extend it, the more the price goes up, and how does that get paid back, either through bills or through taxation? You're just, perpetuating that higher for longer repayment, either through taxes or bills. But I think the idea is that if you can get through this winter and next, then you've got time to get some of these supply side reforms. You can get your ducks in a row when it comes to procuring energy. You can have, sign a deal with the US, with Norway, whatever. Just get through this period of trauma, and everyone can relax and say, how are we going to deal with this? Let's get through the immediate crisis. And listen, in a few years' time,
yes,
by the time we're playing this back, Hinkley Point C will be working. That's an extra 7% of electricity.
Yeah.
You'll have more renewables, more solar, building a bridge to the future. That's kind of the plan here.
All right, Simon, Jack, thank you very much. Emily, is this a good idea?
I think that there is no quick fix to this problem. Obviously, wholesale costs have gone up extraordinarily fast and higher than most people had anticipated. I think that rather than messing around with price signals, price controls, a better idea would be to have targeted support. If we freeze energy bills across the board, we're essentially having the taxpayer, the current taxpayer and the future taxpayer subsidising the cost of, I don't know, a millionaire's private heated swimming pool in their house. I think it would be far better for the government to have targeted support to those who most need it. That's in businesses as well as individuals, rather than messing around with incentives, which could mean that we actually worsen and prolong the crisis in terms of supply.
Chris?
I think the question here is obviously targeted support would be favourable. I agree. It's whether we have the time, given this is coming in the 1st of October,
but
the price
why bother
rise.
with all the packages that have already been announced? What might stick to?
Well, this is one big, bazooka of a policy that we can get in place quite quickly in comparison
tens of billions
to the
just
targeted
going
approach.
out and out, and it doesn't seem that there's any structure to it. £400 here, £600 here, 1,200 total to those on benefits, and then suddenly this freezing energy bills. There's no coherence.
But I think the scale of the challenge that we face right across society is that we're talking about the vast majority of the public who are going to really struggle to pay their bills. That's working families, it's pensioners, it's people who would not otherwise regard themselves as people that would be struggling. But we're talking about potentially the majority of the public being pushed into fuel poverty unless we take action on the price cap. I think the key question, however, is who pays for this? And I think it should be those oil and gas companies that are making massive unexpected profits, way beyond what they'd anticipated, so much that they don't know what to do with it. They should be taxed, and that money should go towards freezing bills. I think that is the right approach. That's the way Labour will be doing things.
Right. In terms of Labour's plan, I mean, your plan is to spend nearly £30 billion freezing energy bills for 6 months, partly funded through a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. I mean, Liz Truss's plan, if it turns out to be in the region of 100 to 130 billion, is on a totally different scale. The windfall tax, from the figures that we've had, raises £8 billion. It is, to coin a phrase, a drop in the ocean.
Labour's led on this consistently, so if Liz Truss has decided that she needs to act on this, I'd be glad of it. But the key question is who is going to pay for it? And I don't think it should fall to working families to pay for that.
Well, I think when it comes to looking at the costs, I believe what we also need to look at is demand, because one of the other questions here is we're just putting a sticking plaster in place for 2 years where people will still use the same amount of gas. This isn't a problem that's facing the UK. Germany's potentially preparing for power blackouts. Yep. So if we remain...
but that's the problem with freezes and caps and so on. Yeah. It means that people then don't look to be more energy efficient.
Net zero,
and I think with the windfall tax, it sounds great, it's populist. People say, oh, a windfall tax, yes, those oil and gas companies. But every time we put these retrospective taxes on these companies, it sounds great, but it means that investment, which is what we need,
their investment plans
impacted.
Their investment plans will continue as they would.
Because
they weren't... They weren't planning to make
future investment.
They weren't planning to make this level of profit.
Well, hang on, let Bridget finish her point and I'll come to you.
Yeah, they weren't planning to make this level of profit. It goes way above and beyond anything they'd anticipated.
But so it will not call into question. They made during the pandemic either. Do we subsidise them then?
It won't call into question their investment plans, and they've actually, many of them have said that publicly as well. But I accept that there is a need to plan for the long term too. Yes, we've got these short-term pressures. Although I think telling people, domestic customers, just to cut back on their use, I tell you, when I speak to people, when I'm knocking on doors, people are answering the door in their coats.
I mean,
they're already cutting back on it.
In order to cope with demand.
Right.
Well, yeah, I agree, but unfortunately your government over the last 12 years hasn't done anywhere near enough on that. We've got the most badly insulated homes in Europe.
I mean, should the government be talking to people, having a conversation about reducing their energy usage? Will the package, in the way Emily just said, actually be a disincentive to that? Because people will think, well, my bills are frozen for however long.
I think we need to have a mature... Remember, like 10 years ago, David Cameron sort of said, oh, people need to think about putting jumpers on. That was a ridiculous thing to say. But what is a sensible thing to say is making sure people's boilers are set at an eco setting at 60 degrees, that they actually look at the efficiency measures that they can do quite easily in order to help. And that's not being patronising, that's just actually being sensible.
But the reason people will do that quickly is because of the prices going up. And so if you freeze prices, it won't have that immediate effect on people reducing their usage of energy, which is what everyone's wanted us to do for so long. It's part of the net zero agenda.
Yeah, people are doing that already. They are already doing it. They're not daft, and they don't need politicians telling them to turn down the heating a bit or maybe use a bit less electricity. What they do need, however, is politicians to take action to make sure that their homes are better insulated, because not only is it the right thing to do, but it creates really good jobs right across our country, particularly in areas of the country that desperately need it. There's a really strong economic case for it, as well as the impact it would make on family bills. If we'd been acting now, if we'd acted last year, families could have saved £1,000 on their bills if more homes were insulated. That is a massive difference.
And we're going to talk about net zero in just a moment. Emily, are you disappointed by the prospect of Liz Truss doing what she said she wouldn't do broadly, which is a massive state intervention in the form of a handout?
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because everyone thinks of her as this free market classical liberal who's going to be radical and be like Thatcher 2.0, and then immediately it's a massive intervention in the energy markets.
Because it's needed?
Well, one could argue that. I would argue, as I said before, that targeted support would be more useful so it doesn't mess around with incentives in terms of investment in supply. But I guess she's been dealt the card she's been dealt.
Right. I mean, no handouts, she said. I mean, this is and will be a massive state intervention. She also said we're going to cut taxes, but actually people could be paying through the nose on higher energy bills for 20 years.
I think we'll see what happens. Obviously, Kwasi Kwarteng, who may be the Chancellor for all we know, has talked about fiscal loosening, so it's not yet clear whether this is coming from borrowing or not for the future.
Well, what would you prefer?
Well, I think we are in just a moment of such severe difficulty when it comes to people receiving these bills. As Bridget said, it's everyone across the board, that we do need to take immediate action, because the risk is of an economic unwinding. Pubs will be shutting, businesses will be shutting. There's a question around economic growth being affected here if we didn't take action on any bills. So I think Liz believes in growth, and I think this is potentially a growth
Everyone
strategy
believes
to make
in
sure
growth.
the economy
It's how you actually achieve it. I mean, how ideological do you think she's actually going to be? Actually, I'll put that to you, Jack, because as Emily said, she certainly paints herself ideologically to the right, to some extent Thatcherite, not wholly. But do you think actually she's going to have to be more pragmatic?
Well, evidently, as we see in this conversation, she wants to be ideological, but right now her ideology is colliding with reality, which is there is no question she's going to have to make a massive intervention in the market immediately, or she'll be hauled out of office again a few weeks later. And it doesn't matter whether you have these beliefs about how markets should run or not. Millions of people need some way of paying their bills this winter, and so she's got no choice but to act like this. She probably hates it, just like Boris Johnson hated having lockdowns during the coronavirus situation. But sometimes as Prime Minister you have to deal with the real world as it is, and not the beliefs you've built up over the past however many years.
Well, that must be a relief to you, Bridget Phillipson.
Well, her beliefs are quite flexible, it would appear, but I mean, we've had a summer of the Conservative Party turning in on itself, arguing amongst themselves when we face this terrible kind of cost of living challenge. So we've had that summer of indecision where action hasn't been taken. That has caused real worry and real anxiety for people right across our country. And that, I think, where we need to see action. We've been clear for a very, very long time about how we would sort that out with that plan around energy bills paid for on the oil and gas companies. It remains to be seen whether, what Truss will bring forward matches, I think, the scale of the problem that we see right now.
Let's just show you this image here of Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, meeting the Queen, smiling there. An audience with the Queen, her first audience with the Queen. Of course, there'll be many more to follow. And this is now the formal handover of power, as the Queen has invited Liz Truss to form the next government. After this meeting, Liz Truss will depart and arrive at Downing Street, giving a speech at 4 o'clock this afternoon, weather permitting, outside, otherwise it will be given inside before she then puts the finishing touches to her cabinet and her government, and that will no doubt be announced this afternoon. She's had quite a lot of time to actually put it together. But let's just briefly show you a book, Britannia Unchanged. This will be familiar to you while we end this discussion on ideology, Chris Skidmore, because you co-wrote it a little while ago. It's true. With
Anyone never in cabinet.
with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, who could be the new Chancellor. So what does that book tell us about Liz Truss's ideology and whether she will dump it or not?
Well, I mean, there was the big reveal because, during the leadership contest, obviously she named Dominic Raab's chapter, which obviously was the one about sort of the idlers or whatever that sort of was he put in there.
Well,
but we had
British workers being among the worst idlers in the world, and Liz Truss said that was Dominic Raab.
So we had this.
Is that true, or was it collective responsibility?
Well, obviously, I don't know if you remember, there was a One Nation book that came out in the 50s, and we've modelled our Britannia Unchanged on that. Well, anyway, the point was we all signed up to basically a text, and we wouldn't say which chapter was each person's, because then it got more coverage because it seemed this big mission.
You wouldn't say, no one would be ashamed of saying that, would they? No one in the Conservative Party would be ashamed of suggesting that British people are idlers.
Well, British people aren't idlers. The point is it was one around productivity, and obviously
the
phrase got sort of picked out. But
if they all think, they must all agree, sure.
I wrote the innovation chapter on Israel, and what I would say, speaking to
we may be moving off the subject.
I think the Britannia Unchained, and backing the future, as was talked about earlier, this bridge to the future is exactly the vision I hope that Liz will put in place. So for net zero, for example, I see that entirely in keeping with Britannia Unchained, about growing global Britain, about bringing inward investment, about the new technologies that can help deliver for us for the future. So I think Liz has been quite consistent. She had that free enterprise group that I was also a member of, and actually she's remained consistent on backing free enterprise.
I do think her philosophy has remained consistent, regardless of her shift from Liberal Democrat Remainer to free market Brexiteer. But we should be looking forward to the fiscal event to see whether she will have these tax cuts, considering the 90 billion or whatnot this freeze will cost.
All right, we're going to move on. You mentioned net zero. Let's just have a little look at this. Fire! This is a video of former government minister and COP26 President Alok Sharma. He's blowing up a coal power station last year. This was in the run-up to the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Chris, you're chair of the Net Zero Support Group, and you're about to go on your tour, Rolling Thunder. Was that a good idea?
Well, we have to get off coal. It happens to be the most intensive carbon-generating fuel there is, and it's not just the UK who's made a commitment. Most of the world recognises that we need to get off coal. Actually, gas was a bridge fuel to get off coal in the first place, and what we need to do is have a diverse energy supply that has gas as a means to get to net zero by 2050. What I would say is that net zero allows us to continue to grow our economy. It's producing new jobs across the region. One of the reasons why I've got this net zero tour is that I want to demonstrate the benefit that net zero can bring to the regions with the all-party group on the environment. So it's cross-party, but at the same time, people are getting on with the job. And this energy transition isn't some nice thing to do for middle-class people who want to go green. It's essential for the future security of the UK.
Emily, is net zero a help or a hindrance at the moment?
What do we do with that coal mine still being open? That coal power plant, no. But seriously, I do worry that some of the incentives in the net zero has become quite dogmatic. It's disincentivised exploration in oil and gas in this country, and obviously the moratorium on fracking, which could have been quite useful for us now in terms of increasing supply. And I think that it's left us quite exposed to what we've seen. Geopolitics changes a lot, and Putin switching off the pipeline only last week. I mean, I do think that net zero has something to do with that. We have to decarbonise, but it can't come from central planning from government.
The problem is I signed net zero into law in 2019, but we'd already known for like 15 years before that the North Sea gas shelf was on decline, and it was the rising price of the North Sea gas shelf that put us on independency on foreign petro states and gas suppliers. If we'd taken action earlier to be more diversified in our approach, and you've probably seen this clip of Nick Clegg back in 2010 saying, if we open a nuclear power plant, it won't be on stream until 2022. I mean, gosh, if we'd only got on with nuclear then, we could have been a bit more like France.
Right.
And been more self-sufficient.
Which is true. They have.
France has many old nuclear plants that don't seem to be functioning very well, and they're likely to have a blackout before we do. So I'm not sure that's a great model.
Well,
and also, if you look at Sizewell C, it's going to cost us tens of billions of pounds and take God knows how long.
But
I don't think governments pick winners very well.
It's sufficient, and I think what we need to do is not pick just one winner. We do need to diversify our supply. The problem with fracking, and we'll see what happens. Liz has said it's going to be with public support,
which means it won't happen.
We're coming up to a general election, and good luck to anyone who wants to sort of pitch, a leaflet out saying support fracking. But if there is support within those constituencies, then we'll see what happens. But I personally think it's not the right answer. It creates stranded assets, and also you need about 1,000 fracking wells to make up for the same amount of gas that we've lost from Russia, which made up 8% of our gas supply.
Right. What's your response?
I think net zero is a brilliant opportunity to obviously do the right thing by the climate and the change that we need to see, but also to create really great jobs across our country. I think there is a really great opportunity there to create well-paid, secure jobs, and there is a role for government in doing that, working with the private sector, working with trade unions to make that happen. It's the right thing to do. It creates jobs. But alongside that, it allows us to address those issues that we face, both around energy security, where we haven't had, over the last 12 years, a plan for our long-term energy security, but also in addressing energy bills too. So how do we bring down people's energy bills? We insulate their homes, we provide alternatives, we make sure we've got strong investment in renewables and in new nuclear, something I'm afraid we haven't seen at the scale that was required over these last 12 years.
May I just say that the government has tried many times to have various schemes in terms of energy efficiency, and unfortunately they've failed for a number of different reasons, not least in uptake. People simply haven't wanted to. So I don't know what government scheme is suddenly going to be able to come into every single person's home in this great country and suddenly make them energy efficient.
I think you've got a point that
well insulated.
Liz has talked about making net zero more friendly for private investment and businesses. I think that's a really important point. It can't just be the state that does it.
But the government has to lead it. If you're to do it at scale, then I think it is a question for government getting involved. And the schemes that we've had in the past have often been too complicated and then cut.
Right, Jack, just briefly, do you think anywhere in the country will say yes to fracking in their local area?
Oh, I doubt it. And it's highly unpopular everywhere you go. There's protests everywhere you go, and people might vaguely like the idea of it, but as long as it's nowhere near where they live. And we've seen how difficult it is just to build houses in this country, which are something that I think most people would get behind as an idea. I think fracking is probably way down the list of people's priorities. I mean, the thing about net zero is there's a good case to be made if you want to make it about Britain being independent, about using less energy in the current crisis. It's exactly what we should be doing. But whether Liz Truss wants to make that, given she was slagging off solar farms the other day, remains to be seen.
Right, well, let's return to Liz Truss's bulging in tray. Show you this story, BBC News, train strikes. More drivers set to walk out on the 15th of September. There are plenty other sectors also threatening strike action, and those are already being taken by certain sectors. And it could continue throughout the autumn. Let's talk to Mick Whelan, General Secretary of ASLEF, the trade union that represents the train drivers. Welcome to you, Mick. Inflation is running at about 10.10%. Is that what you're asking for in terms of a pay rise, or that's what your members are asking for in terms of a pay rise?
No, we haven't done that. What we've said in each of the companies that we work for, we'll be guided by our negotiators what they feel is right. So the real underlying problem here is that we haven't had a pay rise for 3 years. We seem to have a transport minister who doesn't believe we deserve one for the next 10 years. I keep hearing talk about modernisation and reform, and we're not seeing real modernisation talks. What we're seeing is hundreds of millions of pounds of productivity for nothing as the only way forward.
Right. Should mixed members get a pay rise in the region of 6 to 8%?
I mean, I think I came on this programme a couple of months back, and we were talking at a sort of different level. Yeah, I mean, the problem is this has gone on for so long now. That I do wonder now that obviously people are more flexible in their working practices when they can be, so they can just go on Zoom. So actually, I don't know whether the strike is actually going to make any difference because people just work from home.
But should they get a pay rise?
Well, obviously we've spent most of the programme talking about the fact that the government may be taking out sort of spending £130 billion on energy bills. Right. Bridget's mentioned about the NHS. We're now spending £150 billion on the NHS, compared to £100 billion back in 2010. There are a lot of prevailing headwinds, to put it that way, and I think we need to prioritise what needs to come first. And having a strike at this time is like the last thing we need.
Right. Well, Bridget Phillipson's nodding in agreement, so you don't think they should get a...
No, I think that workers deserve a pay rise. Right. I agree. Sorry. sorry, I was
Yes,
afraid
well, no,
I wasn't.
yes.
I wasn't agreeing with. Sorry, I wasn't agreeing with Chris there. My mistake. No, of course, I think workers deserve a pay rise. Over the last 12 years, workers right across, particularly the public sector and those doing vital jobs that we clapped and praised during the pandemic.
How big should that pay rise be?
I'm not going to pluck a figure out of the air.
Okay. So do you think the strikes are justified?
I think that it's important that workers retain the right to go on strike, that's really important in a free society. And I can see why mixed members, when confronted with a Transport Secretary who won't sit down and try and negotiate a compromise that they can accept, both around terms and conditions and on pay, I can see why they've got to the position that they voted to strike. A Labour government would take a responsible approach. We get around the table, we try and sort it out. It feels to me a lot of the time that the government want to stoke industrial disputes rather than actually get solutions to these problems.
Well, before I get a response there from Chris, yesterday Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, said the new Prime Minister Liz Truss is not on the side of working people. Is Keir Starmer?
Well, I spent a lot of time with Keir Starmer. I believe he is. There are one or two things we disagree on,
which are
particularly in relation to picket lines.
Yes.
But let's look at where we are. As we've seen, key workers went to work during the pandemic. We kept food and medicine moving around the country. We got other key workers to work. We did what we were asked. We work for 14 different private companies. We do not work for the government. The government wants to set the tone and level of pay that we get. Yet the people that we work for made over £500 million during the pandemic. Surely the people that actually kept the trains running deserve a share of that.
Right. Chris?
Well, the government did step in during the pandemic to make sure that the train industry survived. We seem to forget that. So there was this enormous investment that if the government hadn't taken action then...
of £16 billion.
16 billion, there we go. So
because the government mandated a lockdown across the country.
You were against the lockdown?
No,
The
of course I wasn't against the
Labour
lockdown.
Party
Of course I supported it. But if you're going to enforce a lockdown, then you've got to provide support for those industries affected. It just seems obvious.
Mick,
there is a cost, and that's what we...
Well, can I pick up, Mick? You said there are a couple of things you disagree on with Keir Starmer. One of them is over picket lines. There has been some confusion, Bridget, over the summer, over the message from Keir Starmer to the Shadow Cabinet on strikes and whether you can join workers on the picket line. What have you been told you can or can't do?
I've had no discussion about it. My personal view is that it doesn't add anything because, I want to be the next Education Secretary in a Labour government. And if I were in that government, it would be my job to negotiate with trade unions as part of that process that takes place. Ministers have to be involved in signing that off around terms and conditions and around pay. It's all of that taken together. So I don't think being on a picket line would change that. But I do completely understand why so many workers right across key areas of our economy are absolutely fed up with the fact that they've had shrinking wages, prices are going up, and they feel completely abandoned by the government.
Right. On picket lines, what is your disagreement then, Mick? Should Shadow Cabinet members be expected to be seen on the picket lines?
I think traditionally, if you support the workers in your area, and every Shadow Cabinet member is a trade union member, it's on the rules of the Labour Party, supporting the people that you want to vote.
I'm just going to cut in. I'm so sorry, Mick, because you can't see. In fact, we've just seen Liz Truss getting into the car. She's just leaving with her husband, leaving Balmoral, that is, after her meeting with the Queen and having been asked to form the next government. She will be heading straight back to London and to Downing Street. Mick Whelan, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
So, yeah, I think traditionally, if you actually want the workers in the UK, whether affiliated to the Labour Party or not affiliated, to vote with you, you've got to confirm to them that you're on their side. Now, the policies that we're going to produce show that we're on their side. Sometimes we need actions to go alongside those policies.
Jack, do you think there's going to be a resolution?
It feels like a long way off, doesn't it, given the scale of what people are asking for, the rate of inflation and the sort of shape of the government that's coming in. I think it's a problem for both main parties, to be honest. I mean, it's obviously a problem for Keir Starmer because we've seen it every time there's been a strike. We have this ongoing row that you've just been talking about picket lines. But I don't think for Liz Truss either it's very good if half the country isn't functioning.
Indeed. Thank you to Mick Whelan for joining us. That's all we've got time for today. It'll be the first Prime Minister's questions for the new Prime Minister Liz Truss tomorrow, and we'll be here, of course, covering it live on Politics Live at 11:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.
Now that is a date can't miss, 11:15 tomorrow. Wee. Oh yeah, baby, oh yeah. Wanna see that? PMQ tomorrow, 11:15. Be here or be squared. Etc. Anyway.